Hello, my name is PZF, and today I wanted to share my analysis of the relationship between the best damage dealers in the world and their healing counterparts. This analysis is focused on Season of Discovery Phase 2 in the Nomergun 10-man raid. So now let's get into it. I would like to start by defining the question I'm seeking to answer, which is, in World of Warcraft, Season of Discovery Phase 2, specifically in the Nomergon raid, how much does healer DPS impact the performance of the best damage dealers in the world in terms of their DPS on bosses? In other words, is there a significant relationship between the world's best damage dealers and the amount of damage their healer counterparts do? In order to answer this question, I analyzed data for all 6 bosses in Nomergon. Here's a screenshot of some of the data I collected using the Warcraft Logs API and Python. I extracted the top 20 parses for all 6 bosses, leading to a table containing 120 rows of data, which was due to 20 rows for each of the 6 bosses. This data includes damage dealer DPS and the rank, as well as the total healer DPS, which was the sum of all the healers' DPS in the case where there were multiple healers. This data was collected at the end of March, and so it's not the very last week of Phase 2. But that's just a caveat. So let's take a closer look at what the data looks like. Um, so here is the data for Mechanical Menagerie. The healer DPS column is the total DPS of the healers, and the DPS of the damage dealers is in the right column. And going forward, I'll just refer to this as DPS. So this data is sorted from greatest to least in terms of DPS. So the first row in the data on the screen is the world #1 DPS for Mechanical Menagerie, which at the time was 1270.44. So this is what the data looks like when it is plotted for Mechanical Menagerie. And there's also a line of best fit, which you can see as well, which is relatively flat. Before discussing the relationship between healer DPS and DPS for Mechanical Menagerie, I just wanted to point out some interesting statistics. So 3 out of 5 of the top Mechanical Menagerie parses had healers that did less than 20 DPS. And 5 out of the top 20 parses had healers that did less than 20 DPS. So here's another interesting data point. This is the highest DPS on Mechanical Menagerie in the world, which is 1270.44 DPS. This was achieved by the warlock named Taco on the Shadow Strike realm. And in this fight, there were 2 healers in the group with Taco. There was a priest named Burn City X and a resto druid named Amras. Interestingly, neither the priest or the druid did any damage this entire fight. This can be seen by looking at the graph's x-axis, which we can see for this point here is at 0. Just to confirm that they both did 0 DPS in this fight, I looked up all the spells they cast in Warcraft logs, and we can see that they did not cast any damage dealing abilities. So now let's just review the regression analysis results. So this is the image of the results I got using linear regression to compare healer DPS and DPS on Mechanical Menagerie. These results are somewhat surprising and counterintuitive. The correlation coefficient R squared is 0.003, suggesting a weak correlation between healer DPS and DPS for top Mechanical Menagerie parses. So here is the regression coefficient, which is essentially the slope of the line. And interestingly, the relationship between healer DPS and DPS is actually negative, which is shown by this number, negative 0.0285. So the regression coefficient of negative 0.0285 suggests that every 1 DPS the healer does, the damage dealer's DPS is actually decreased by 0.0285. Now, to be clear, I'm not doing inferential statistics here because I made the assumption for this analysis that the top 20 players were my population. That means that just because there appears to be a weak negative relationship here, I'm not claiming that this relationship applies to other populations of players. This is simply an observation that only applies to this population. Either way, it is still an odd result, which I did not expect to see. At this point, this led to more question than answers. And like, why would there be a negative relationship between healer DPS and DPS? I was not sure why this was happening yet, so I decided to look at all the data together instead of just one fight. And that's what this plot shows. The highlighted data here are specifically for the Grubbis parses. Here is the line of best fit for the Grubbis encounter, and this line shows um, another weak negative relationship. This means that the counterintuitive relationship between healer DPS and damage dealer's DPS also persists for Grubbis as it did for Mechanical Menagerie. But let's look at more data. So here's Viscous Fallout. Again, we see a similar trend line. And here's Crowd Pummeler, another weak negative relationship. Electrocutioner 6000, Mechanical Menagerie, and Thermoplug. So here's all the boss encounters and their trend lines plotted for each fight together on the same graph. So it appears that when separated by boss fights, there's a weak negative relationship between DPS and healer DPS for every fight. Now let's look back at all of our data together again. And here I calculated the line of best fit for all fights when aggregated together. Interestingly, in this case, we now see a weak positive relationship. So it appears when aggregated over all boss fights, there is a weak positive relationship between healer DPS and DPS. This counterintuitive finding is an example of Simpsons Paradox. Simpsons Paradox is a phenomenon in probability and statistics in which a trend appears in several groups of data but disappears or reverses when the groups are combined. Some of the reasons that this paradox can arise is due to lurking confounding variables as well as randomness. In this scenario, there are likely many lurking confounding variables, such as the length of the fight, armor value, and fight mechanics that require movement. This means that if we ignore factors like these and aggregate over all the boss fights in Nomergon, it is likely that both heals and DPS will have higher damage output in certain fights, while in other fights it will be lower. However, when we control for these confounding variables, we see the opposite trends emerge. Now, I will show an example of this visually. So here's a way to illustrate why the aggregate relationship is weak and positive, while the relationship amongst groups is weak and negative. Here, I'm just looking at the short fights in the green box. Short fights are around 30 seconds for the top parses. So this is Grebus and Viscous Fallout. Here are the medium fights. So here I am highlighting the data for Crowd Pummeler. Just to pause for a second, I wanted to talk about this data point here. Here you can see there are some healers that are doing abnormally high DPS. This was done by a raid on the Lone Wolf server and from a priest named Gillet, who was doing 100 DPS, and a mage healer named Twu, who did 545 DPS. So their combined DPS was 645. This I'm considering an outlier. And for the sake of this example, I'm going to remove it. So now we can see a smaller group of healers and DPS grouped together in the blue box. Here's Electrocutioner, which is another medium length fight. And here is Mechanical Menagerie, which is a medium to long length fight, relatively speaking. And here's the data for Thermoplug, which is the longest fight. As you can see, there are clear groups that emerge when data is grouped together by fight length. And I suspect that fight length is a confounding factor that leads to a different relationship amongst the aggregated data versus the data while it's separated into groups. Yeah, so here's the trend line for all the data again. And here is the trend line when Grebus and Viscous Fallout are aggregated together. So we can see amongst this group here, not only does Grebus have a weak negative relationship by itself, but also when aggregated with Viscous Fallout, which is a fight that shares a similar fight length, we see a similar weak negative relationship. And the same is true when grouping together Crowd Pummeler, Electrocutioner, 6000, and Mechanical Menagerie. And then again, this is just the trend line for Thermoplug, which is the longest fight. And just going back to this, these I'm considering a subgroup of medium length fights. So just as a recap, when comparing healer DPS and DPS, it appears that the relationship is weak and negative when separated by encounter, but it is weak and positive when all fights are aggregated together. This is likely due to hidden or not so hidden confounding variables such as the length of the fight, the armor values, and different mechanics that require movement. So this is an interesting paradox and an interesting relationship that's found in the data, but why does it matter? And what does it really mean? So it seems that this has created more questions rather than answering any questions. For example, only if there's only a weak relationship between healer DPS, whether it's positive or negative, depending on if you're looking at the um, aggregated data or the data amongst groups, does healer DPS matter in raid? And should we bring more hybrid DPS healers and less pure DPS? Or should we bring more pure DPS, more pure healers, and less hybrid healers? Furthermore, if you play a healer like myself, knowing the impact of healer DPS on the raid will influence how you choose your gear, how you choose your talents and playstyle. So in order to try to answer these questions, I'll try to summarize some of the insights I found during this analysis using the data I collected. So I found that the world's best damage dealers brought hybrid healers, pure healers, and sometimes no healers for shorter fights. Healer DPS ranged from 0 to over 400, but was not correlated with damage dealer DPS. 52.6% of all healers recorded in Phase 2 were priests, while 67.1% of healers recorded in the top 20 parses were priests. So this means that priests are more common in the top performing raids. So this is interesting because priest DPS is not the highest damage dealing healers. Mages are, at least in Phase 2. So here's a question. Does healer DPS matter in raid? I'd say it does not. So what I found is that the data shows the relationship between healer DPS and DPS is weak for the world's top parsers in Nomergon. When the data is separated into subgroups based on fights, as well as when it's aggregated together. This means that you can bring healers that will do no damage and still achieve a world first parse, which Taco did. When he not only brought one, but he brought two healers that did 0 DPS when he achieved a world rank #1 on Mechanical Menagerie. Does this mean that you should avoid DPSing as a healer? I would say no. I think the answer is more complex. I think that differing raid compositions, strategies, players, and random events in these fights is likely the reason for the counterintuitive relationship between healer and damage dealer DPS. I believe that given more time to fully min-max Nomergon, we would have likely seen more similarity across raid composition, gear, strategies, and other factors. If the raid became more homogenized, I suspect a stronger relationship between healer DPS and DPS would likely emerge, given more confounding factors would be held constant. For example, the raid composition, the strategies, the gear. So, question, should we bring more hybrid healers or more pure healers and more pure DPS? The answer I'd say is I think both are valid. Some groups that I observed brought multiple pure healers. Some brought hybrid healers and some just brought shadow priests. From what I've found, the data shows that both healing playstyles, being hybrid and heretic, can enable your DPS to perform at the highest level. So what are the main takeaways? Based on this data, I think that as healers, we should focus on the outcome of the raid and not as much as our output, whether that is heals per second or damage per second. Um, so this means that it's okay if you enjoy playing a hybrid healer for you to do as much damage as you can, as long as you still do your job as a healer and keep other players alive. But I think that it would be false to say that those who choose to play heretic healers and therefore do less DPS are griefing the raid. The data shows that in Season of Discovery, Phase 2, Nomergon, that high and low DPS healers both accompanied the world's highest damage dealers. In my opinion, healing is relative, meaning that there is not a perfect rotation, set of gear, or formula to play optimally, at least in this version of the game. I mean, there's a caveat here where you can obviously play poorly by maybe not casting the correct ranks of the spells, or maybe if you're a priest and you're stacking agility gear. I'm kind of assuming that you're reaching all the common sense or the basic requirements of your class. Um, but if that's true, the healers are different than DPS, because DPS are focused on their output while healers are focused on the outcome. And this means that there is a correct DPS rotation and there is a correct set of gear and a correct set of stat priorities and things like that. So, but I see this as a benefit of playing a healer, which is that you can heal at the most competitive level in Season of Discovery without having to min-max to the extreme. I think people will be happy to play with you as a healer as long as you created a positive outcome when you raided with them, i.e., they got a 99 parse or they didn't die in raid. Um, so take what you will with this information, and I hope you can use it to your advantage or you found it useful in some way. So thanks very much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.